The snow had stopped falling sometime before dawn, though the wind still scraped across the plains, dragging a veil of frost behind it. The small shack stood half buried in drifts, its boards shrunk and splintered by years of cold. Inside, the fire had long gone out. Only a thin ribbon of smoke clung to the chimney, wavering like a memory that did not wish to leave. Clara sat near the hearth, her shawl drawn tight, the hem stiff with ice. Her youngest child slept in her lap, face pale as milk. The other four lay under a quilt stitched from old flour sacks, their breaths shallow and slow. Outside, the world was white and merciless. Inside, the silence pressed harder than the cold. Her husband had been gone for 3 weeks, lost to a storm while hunting near the ridge. The men from town had brought back his horse 2 days later, riderless, eyes wild. No one spoke much. They left her a few sacks of cornmeal, some beans, and their condolences that sounded too practiced to hold meaning. Clara had tried to pray, but words no longer came easy. The Bible sat open on the table, pages curled and smudged. She could not bring herself to read it any more. "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away," the preacher had said at the graveside. But all she felt was the taking. She rose, careful not to wake the baby, and stepped outside. The wind caught her skirts, tugging like a child needing attention. The sky stretched empty from one horizon to the other, a hard, unbroken gray. She stared toward the distant ridge, where the world had swallowed her husband whole. Her breath made ghosts in the air. The nearest town was 20 miles south, a place of saloons, cattle yards, and men who looked at widows too long. She had no horse, no wagon, and 5 mouths to feed. The food would last perhaps 4 days. Beyond that, there was nothing but hope, and she had little left of that. She went back inside and found her eldest, Martha, awake. The girl was 12, with eyes that had grown too old. "Ma," she whispered. Clara only touched her cheek, tracing the warmth there. "Go back to sleep, darling." But the girl did not. Children sense despair the way birds sense storm. Later, when the sun tried to break through, Clara packed what she could: blankets, bread crusts, her husband's pocket knife. She wrapped the baby tight and told the others they were leaving. The older two carried small bundles. The younger clung to her skirts. She locked the door, though there was nothing left worth stealing. They walked south through the snow. The wind cut their faces raw, and each step sank deep. The baby whimpered until his voice gave out. Clara sang to keep them moving, her voice cracked and thin but steady. A hymn her mother once sang while sewing by candlelight. By dusk, they had reached the edge of the valley where the land dipped into scrub and frozen grass. She could see smoke far off a ranch, maybe, or just her imagination. Her legs trembled. She pressed the baby close, whispering nonsense to keep herself from collapsing. That was when she heard it, the sound of hooves, faint at first, then nearer. She turned, heart thudding, half fearing it was wolves. But through the veil of snow came a horse and rider, dark against the pale distance. The man slowed as he neared, his coat dusted white, hat pulled low. He stopped a few yards away, watching the small cluster of figures huddled in the wind. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, carrying more wonder than suspicion. "Ma'am," he said, "you headed somewhere?" Clara could not answer at first. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw. The baby stirred, and she shifted him, her arms trembling from the weight. "Nowhere," she managed. "Nowhere left to go." The man dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, respectful. "Name's Jonah," he said. "I got a ranch just north of here. Ain't much, but it's warm." She looked past him to the open plain. Trust was a luxury she no longer owned. Yet the children shivered beside her, and the light was nearly gone. He must have seen the hesitation in her eyes. "I don't mean you harm," he said, removing his hat. "Got food, blankets. You and the young'uns can rest a while." Clara glanced at her children. The eldest nodded almost imperceptibly. And that was how they followed the stranger through the snow, one weary mother, 5 hungry children, and a cowboy who seemed carved from the same cold land. The night swallowed them whole, but somewhere ahead, a single lamp burned through the storm. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from rough-hewn logs that smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Jonah pushed the door open, letting them into a dim warmth that felt almost unreal. The fire crackled low, a steady heart beating in the silence. A hound lifted its head from the corner, gave a single low whine, then settled again, as if understanding the nature of the guests. Clara stood just inside, not daring to move further. Her skirt was crusted with frost, her hair stuck to her cheeks. The children huddled close to her, eyes wide. Jonah knelt near the hearth, adding more wood until the flames leapt higher, filling the room with a copper light. "Sit," he said quietly. "You look about ready to fall." Clara hesitated, then sank onto a wooden chair by the fire. Heat licked at her frozen fingers, and she flinched. Her youngest began to cry softly, more from exhaustion than fear. Jonah found a tin pot, poured in water, and set it to warm. Then he opened a cupboard and pulled out a small sack of flour, some beans, and a strip of dried venison. He worked without looking at her, without questions. "Been a rough spell," he said finally. Clara's voice came out like a whisper scraped against stone. "My husband's gone. Storm took him. We had no place after that." Jonah stirred the pot, nodding once. "The prairies got a cruel appetite." They sat in quiet after that, the only sound the simmering water and the soft breathing of children. Outside, the wind keened around the eaves. Inside, something softer began to settle, still fragile, but real. When the stew was ready, Jonah ladled it into tin bowls. The smell filled the cabin, thick and savory. The children ate with a desperation that broke her heart. Jonah turned his eyes to the window, pretending not to see. He ate last. When the little ones finally slept, curled beneath quilts on the floor, Clara stayed awake. She could feel her body wanting to rest, but her mind wouldn't let her. Jonah sat at the table, rolling tobacco between his fingers, his face unreadable in the firelight. "You got kin anywhere?" he asked after a while. She shook her head. "Back east, maybe, but I buried the last letter from them before the war ended. Folks forget you when you marry poor." He gave a soft grunt. "Know that kind of forgetting." Something in his tone made her look up. His gaze was fixed on the fire, as though the flames showed him something she couldn't see. "I had a wife once," he said. "She took fever the second winter after we came out here. Buried her near the cottonwoods by the river. Never could bring myself to leave." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Clara folded her hands together, the skin raw and cracked. "And you stayed," she said softly. "Land was paid for. Promises don't die easy." The words settled between them like dust, quiet and inevitable. For days, the snow didn't lift. Clara helped where she could, washing tin plates, mending a torn sleeve, keeping the children quiet when the wind roared. Jonah worked mostly outside, chopping wood, checking the fences, feeding the cattle. He spoke little, but when he did, it was plain and kind. Martha began to smile again, chasing the hound through the snow near the door. The younger ones laughed too, their voices strange and bright after weeks of silence. Clara watched them, her chest tightening with something that felt like both relief and guilt. Jonah noticed. "They'll need schooling come spring," he said one morning as they stood by the porch. "Town's a good walk, but the teacher's decent." She smiled faintly. "I doubt we'll still be here by then." He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "You could stay a spell. Plenty of room in the bunkhouse. I could use the help." Clara's eyes followed the horizon, flat, endless, and pale, beneath the morning Sunday. "We'd be a burden." Jonah turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, a burden's what keeps a man honest." She didn't know what to say to that, so she only nodded, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, and went back inside to tend the children. That night, after everyone had gone quiet, Clara sat alone by the fire again. The light flickered over Jonah's coat hanging near the door, over the boots lined with snow by the hearth. She thought of her husband, his laugh, his rough hands, the way he used to hum when fixing a fence. The grief still lived inside her, but it had softened, dulled by the rhythm of small mercies. Outside, the wind had gentled. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, lonely but alive. Clara whispered a prayer without words, a thank you, carried in breath alone. Words spread like sickness. It happened the first time Clara stepped into town. The snow had begun to break, and the roads turned to a gray slush that clung to the hem of her skirt. Jonah had hitched the wagon and driven her south with 2 sacks of potatoes and some eggs to trade for lamp oil, salt, and calico for the girls. The children stayed at the ranch under Martha's watch, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt air that was not weighted by worry. But when they rolled into town, she felt eyes on her. The town itself was little more than a scatter of buildings, a lean to blacksmith, a stable, 2 saloons, a store with its porch half-rotted, and a church that looked new and hungry. Mud pooled in the wagon ruts. A windmill creaked a slow complaint. Jonah tied off the team and helped her down without touching her, but it did not matter. Folks saw what they wanted to see. She walked into the general store. The bell above the door jangled. Heat wrapped around her, thick with the smell of grain and coffee. Behind the counter, Mr. Fletcher nodded, though his mouth never quite shaped into a smile. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Clara answered, pulling the list from her apron. Jonah stayed near the door, silent, hat low. Fletcher's wife busied herself with scooping coffee and lye soap into brown paper packets. Her eyes dipped to Clara's worn dress, to the thinness of her wrists, then flicked quick toward Jonah. "You're the woman staying out at Jonah Reed's place," she said finally. Not a question. Clara did not flinch. For now, the silence that followed was not loud. It just pressed. Fletcher's wife spoke again, softer, almost like pity, but not quite. "Folks talk," she said. "Some say he took you in, some say you went to him." Clara felt the slow burn of humiliation in her cheeks. "My husband is dead," she said, keeping her voice even. "I have 5 children. Jonah offered shelter from the cold. That is the truth of it." Fletcher cleared his throat. His eyes slid to Jonah, then back. "Truth don't always matter," he muttered. When they stepped back out into the sharp air, Clara's hands were trembling so hard the packet of salt nearly slipped. Jonah took it from her without comment and set it in the wagon. He did not look angry. That almost made it worse. "They think I'm your mistress," she said quietly. He let out a breath through his nose, half a laugh, half a sigh. "They never did think highly of me to start with." She turned to him. "Does it not bother you?" Jonah looked out across the street, where 2 ranch hands leaned against a water trough, watching like men watch a fire that does not yet threaten their fence. "What bothers me," he said slow, "is you shaking." She swallowed. "I am not used to being looked at that way." "I am," he said. That night she lay awake in the bunkhouse, listening to the wind whisper through the gaps in the boards. The bunkhouse had once held Jonah's hired hands. Men long since drifted on to other ranges. Now it held her and the children. It had become theirs, blankets on the beds, a line of small boots near the door, a crayon drawing tacked up with a bent nail. "Home," her mind said. "No," her fear answered. "Borrowed." Martha slept near the stove with the baby tucked against her, protective even in dreams. The boys sprawled like pups, open-mouthed and careless. Clara traced their outlines in the dark. The thought of tearing them up again, of pushing them back into hunger and cold, made her stomach twist. But Jonah had a life before they arrived. A name, a story. And now, because of her, his name was on other people's tongue. She had seen men ruined by less. The next morning, she rose early and went to work like someone trying to pay a debt before it grew. She hauled water from the pump till her arms burned. She scrubbed shirts against the washboard till her knuckles bled. She patched Jonah's work gloves, stitched a tear in his coat, swept out the tack room, cleaned lantern chimneys till the glass shone. He found her in the yard, sleeves rolled to her elbows, breath hanging like smoke. She was beating dust from a saddle blanket with more fury than sense. "Clara." She did not stop. "Clara," he repeated closer now. "You'll split your hands open doing that." "I do not plan to stay," she said, not looking at him. "But as long as we are here, we will pull our weight." He watched her in that quiet way of his. The morning light picked out the copper in her hair, though most of it was dulled by wind and grief. She was thinner than when he first brought her in. He had noticed. She ate only after the children were full, and even then not much. "You think you're trouble to me," he said. "Aren't we?" "No," he said. Then after a beat, "But I am trouble to you." She stilled. He tipped his head toward town, though town was miles off. "A woman alone, folks call it sad. A woman with a man, they call it sin. Don't much matter that you ain't mine. They'll mark you anyway." Clara stared at him. "And what would you have me do?" He rubbed the back of his neck, choosing his words like someone setting traps. You could stay, he said, not as charity, as work. Her laugh was hoarse. Work. I need hands, he said. This place was meant for more than one man. Fences fall. River floods. Calving comes mean in late winter. You keep books, cook, mend, tend the young'uns, keep watch when I ride out. I'll put your name on part of the stock come spring. You'd have claim. You'd have standing. Hier hat stumbelt, he went on, slower now. And if folks need a word to make sense of that, I'll give them one. She looked at him then. Really looked. Jonah Reed, with his weathered face and sun-cut lines at the eyes. A man who moved like his body had long ago learned not to waste effort. A man who still spoke to his dead wife at the Cottonwood Cross by the river. She had seen him there. She had not told him she had seen. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper. You are asking me to marry you. I am offering to stand beside you, he said. If that is what it takes for folks to leave you be. Her throat tightened. And what of love? He did not look away. Love can come later, he said, or it cannot, but safety ought to come first. Something inside her broke then, and something else, quieter, began to form. Safety. The word felt like warm bread. Clara turned her face away, because tears came too easy these days, and she hated them. Jonah, she said, voice shaking, I do not know that I can give you anything that is not already used up. Jonah's answer was soft. Ma'am, he said, one thing I know. Nothing worth keeping ever came brand new. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then from the road, a rider approached at a gallop, cutting hard across the yard, throwing mud and thawed earth. Jonah's posture changed in an instant, easy calm gone like a snuffed match. He moved to stand in front of her without thinking. The rider hauled his horse up sharp and glared down. He wore a deputy's badge and a scowl too proud for his thin jaw. Jonah Reed, he called. We need to talk about the woman you're harboring. The deputy's words hung in the air like frost, refusing to melt. The horse snorted, stamping the thawing ground, breath pluming white. Jonah didn't move, just shifted slightly so his body stood between the man and Clara. His hand brushed the edge of his coat where a revolver usually rested, though it stayed holstered. Deputy, Jonah said, his voice calm, measured. You got a reason to ride onto my land with talk like that? The man pulled his reins tighter, chin lifting. Got complaints from town. Folks say you're keeping a woman out here. Widow, they say. 5 kids. No kin to you. No preacher's paper between you. Ain't proper, Reed. Ain't lawful either, by some reckonin'. Jonah didn't blink. And which reckonin' is that? Yours? The deputy's mouth twisted. The county's. The good folks who'd rather not see scandal dragging through their church pews. He looked past Jonah then, eyes settling on Clara. Ma'am, he said with mock courtesy, you understand what people think when a woman takes shelter with a man not her husband? Clara felt her face burn, but she lifted her chin. I understand that hunger and cold don't much care for gossip, she said. Nor does a dead husband rise to stop it. Something flickered behind the deputy's expression, irritation, maybe shame. But men like him never stayed with shame long. You ought to come with me, he said. Safer for you and them children. Town'll find work for you. Churchwomen'll see you fed. Jonah stepped forward, slow and deliberate. She's not going anywhere, he said. Then you'll answer for it, the deputy shot back. You think the law bends because you got some land and a name folks used to respect? Times are changin'. Can't just keep people like property. Jonah's eyes darkened, not with anger, but something heavier. You don't know what I keep, he said softly, but you might think on what you throw away. The deputy's hand twitched toward his belt. For a moment the air felt ready to split apart. Then the man laughed a dry, false sound. You always were a fool, Reed. He turned his horse and spat in the dirt. You'll see me again soon. When the hoofbeats faded, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her knees trembled. Jonah turned back to her, the hardness gone from his face. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't mean for... He shook his head. You didn't do nothing wrong. But now they'll come, she said. They'll try to take us. Jonah's gaze moved to the horizon, where the land stretched pale and endless. Then we make it so they can't. That night, they talked long after the children were asleep. Jonah sat at the table, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. Clara stood near the window, watching the moon crawl through a ragged sky. "They'll come with papers," she said, "and words I can't argue." He nodded. "Then I'll give 'em different words." She turned to him. "You mean the marriage?" Jonah's eyes met hers, steady, unreadable. "I mean a truth they can't twist. I don't care if it's just a preacher's ink or God's will, either way. They won't take you from this place." Clara closed her eyes. The room felt too small, too close with his voice in it. "You'd bind yourself to a woman out of pity?" His answer came quiet but sure, out of respect. For a long time she said nothing. The fire crackled, shadows bending against the walls. The baby whimpered once, then stilled again. Finally she crossed the floor and sat across from him. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup he'd left untouched. "When my husband died," she said, "I buried more than him. I buried the part of me that believed in belonging. You cannot just dig that up again because a man is kind." Jonah leaned back, his chair creaking softly. "Maybe not, but you can plant something new." His words sank into the silence like seed into thawing earth. Outside, the wind shifted east, carrying the scent of wet sage and distant rain. The storm had broken. The land was changing. The next morning dawned soft and gray, mist curling low over the fields. Jonah saddled his horse while Clara packed the wagon with blankets and the children's few belongings. She didn't ask where they were going. Maybe she already knew. They rode toward the small chapel south of town, where a preacher came twice a month. As they traveled, the landscape unfolded around them, open plains washed in pale gold, the last of the snow melting into dark furrows. Clara watched the land with quiet wonder. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt something that wasn't despair. When they reached the chapel, the preacher stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. His face softened when he saw the children. He looked at Jonah, then at Clara. "You folks here for a blessing or a burying?" he asked. Jonah's answer came steady. "A beginning." The preacher nodded slow. "Then come in." Inside, the chapel smelled of cedar and dust. Sunlight slanted through the cracked windows, painting stripes of light across the worn pews. Clara stood beside Jonah at the altar, her heart loud in her chest. The children watched from the first bench, eyes wide and solemn. The preacher opened his book, voice trembling slightly with age. "Before God and under his sight, do you take one another to walk through hardship and grace alike?" Jonah's voice was firm. "I do." Clara hesitated only a moment before she whispered, "I do." And just like that, something inside her eased. Not the pain, it would never leave her fully, but the fear. When they stepped back into the morning, the air was clean and full of promise. Jonah took her hand, not like a man claiming, but like one offering. She didn't pull away. The rain came that afternoon, steady and clean, softening the dust and washing the last of the snow from the gullies. It was the kind of rain that made the world smell new again. Clara stood under the porch with the baby on her hip, watching it fall in thin silver lines. The fields shimmered, and the sky was the color of pewter. Somewhere out near the barn, Jonah was mending a fence, his figure blurred in the mist, moving with that same quiet purpose that seemed to belong to him alone. The children were inside, laughing for once, Martha trying to teach the younger ones a hymn she half remembered from before the war. The sound drifted out through the open door, fragile and pure, like a thing the rain itself might protect. Clara closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she did not feel hunted. She was still not certain what to call the life that had begun here, but it had weight and shape now. Something real, something that held. When Jonah came in, wet from the rain, she was tending the fire. He set his gloves near the hearth, shook the water from his hat, and gave her a look that was both shy and sure. "Fence'll hold another season," he said. She nodded, smiling faintly. "You take care of everything that breaks." "Try to," he said, voice low. Then, after a pause, "Some things mend easier than others." They ate supper together at the long table, beans, bread, and the last of the salt pork. The children fell asleep one by one, and soon the only sound was the rain on the roof and the steady ticking of the clock Jonah had built with his own hand. When the baby had drifted off in her arms, Clara looked across at him. The lamplight caught the lines at his eyes, the worn grace of his face. "You meant what you said, didn't you?" she asked softly. "Which part?" "About planting something new," Jonah leaned back, gaze steady. I did. She looked down at her hands, thin, scarred, but steady now. I don't know if I have anything left worth planting. He smiled, the smallest curve of the mouth, but it changed his whole face. You've got faith, he said, and I reckon that's enough for both of us. They did not speak of love, not that night nor the next, but it grew quietly, like grass after rain, unannounced, steady and alive. Spring came slow but certain. The land woke, and so did they. Clara learned to ride again, though her hands trembled the first few times she took the reins. Jonah showed her how to read the sky for storms, how to spot a calf about to drop, how to mend a boot sole with thread instead of hope. The days stretched long, full of work. She gathered eggs at dawn, scrubbed clothes against the washboard till her fingers went raw, planted herbs near the porch, and taught the children their letters by candlelight. It was a hard life, but she met it with a kind of stubborn gratitude. Sometimes Jonah would bring her small gifts from town ribbons, a tin of coffee, a book of psalms he'd found at the mercantile. She'd thank him with a look more than words, and he'd tip his hat as though embarrassed by kindness. Yet not all days were easy. Word traveled slower now, but it traveled still. There were whispers that Jonah Reed had married a desperate woman for her labor, that the children were not his, but he treated them as such because of guilt or pride or loneliness. Once, a wagon from town came up the road uninvited. The preacher was inside, hat in hand, face tight with unease. "Folks talk," he said at the gate. "You'd be wise to come to service. Show them you're living right." Jonah had stood beside her, his arm brushing hers, his voice even. "We live by work and word, preacher, both honest." The man left soon after. That night, as they stood on the porch watching the moon rise over the open fields, Clara said, "Maybe we should go to town next Sunday." Jonah nodded. "If you want it." "I don't," she said. "But maybe it's time they saw what's true." He smiled at that. "Truth don't always change minds, Clara." "No," she said, looking out across the silver fields. "But it changes hearts." Summer came on fierce and bright. The wheat rose tall, the calves fattened, and the children ran barefoot through the fields till dusk. Clara laughed more, now real laughter, not the brittle kind that hides sorrow. She caught herself humming sometimes while she worked, the same way her husband once had. But it didn't hurt anymore, not the same way. Jonah watched her from the porch one evening as the sun sank red and heavy behind the hills. She was hanging laundry, the wind tugging at her dress, her hair coming loose. The sight of her stopped him in a way he hadn't felt in years. She turned, caught his gaze, and didn't look away. That night, when the house was quiet, he found her sitting by the fire, sewing a tear in his shirt. He sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth from her arm. "I was wrong," he said. She looked up. "About what?" "Love," he said simply. "It doesn't come later. It's been here the whole time. Just waited for us to see it." Clara's hands stilled. She looked at him, the weight of all the years and losses between them pressing close, then fading. "I see it," she whispered. Outside, the night was still, the fields dark and wide. Inside, two people sat together in a quiet that was not empty, but full. The next morning, the first of the wildflowers bloomed along the fence line. The days grew long, filled with that golden hum of summer, when the air itself seems to drowse. Grass waved in slow ripples across the plain, cicadas sang from the cottonwoods, and the land, hard and vast, seemed to breathe again. Clara moved through it with a rhythm learned by survival and softened by something else now, belonging. She rose before dawn each morning, when the air was still cool and the light a faint blue on the horizon. Jonah would already be up, tending the stock or checking the fence line. Sometimes she saw him through the window, shoulders bowed, hat low, his shape cut clean against the pale sky. There was something steadying in that sight. The children stirred soon after, and the house filled with sound. Boots thudding, the scrape of spoons, the murmur of prayers half remembered. Clara found herself smiling more often, though she did not always know why. Perhaps because each day began with work she could finish, or because she no longer feared the dusk. Maybe because when Jonah came in from the fields, dusted with sweat and sun, he always paused a moment at the door, like a man thankful to have something worth coming home to. One evening, after the meal was cleared, she took her sewing to the porch. The sky was flushed pink and gold, and the wind carried the sweet smell of hay. Jonah sat on the steps, whittling a piece of cedar. The baby slept in a cradle by the door, and the older children played a quiet game in the yard, their laughter soft as a hymn. She watched Jonah's hands move careful, slow, certain. "You've done that every night this week," she said. He nodded without looking up. "Work keeps the mind from wandering. What are you making?" He turned the wood, revealing a faint shape of bird, wings folded. "Something small," he said. "Something to keep." Clara smiled. "For the baby?" Jonah's eyes lifted to hers. "For you," he said. The words struck her quiet. The dusk deepened, and the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain from the west. For a long time they said nothing more. The world felt wide and gentle for once, as if it might let them be. But peace never stays too long on the prairie. It was near harvest when trouble found them again. Word came by way of a ranch hand writing from town a notice from the sheriff's office. The county wanted Jonah's land for a new rail spur, and the papers said it was government claim. Jonah read the letter by lamplight, his jaw tight. "They aim to cut straight through the south pasture," he said, "right over the river bend." Clara stood beside him, her hands clutching her apron. "Can they?" "They can try." For days after, he was quieter than usual, riding the property line, talking to neighbors, gathering what truth he could. Most had already sold their rights. The railroad promised work, progress, and money enough to tempt any man tired of the land's hunger. But not Jonah. "This place is paid for," he told Clara one night. "Paid in blood and frost and more years than I care to count. I won't let them take it." She knew that tone, hard, unbending. It scared her. "You can't fight them alone," she said. "I won't," he said. "I got you." The words filled her with pride and fear both. That week, the deputy returned the same man who'd come months ago with questions and suspicion. He brought 2 surveyors and a sheriff's stamp. They rode up with the arrogance of those who believe paper weighs more than toil. Jonah met them in the yard. Clara stood on the porch. The children gathered behind her. The men dismounted, their boots sinking into the dry grass. "Read," the deputy said. "This land's been requisitioned. You'll get fair payment." Jonah didn't answer. The deputy continued, waving the document. "You don't move. The law will move you. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Jonah stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "You tell your men they'll not drive iron through this soil while I'm breathin'. This land's fed the hungry, sheltered the lost, and buried the good. You call it dirt. I call it home." The deputy's face reddened. "You defy the county. You'll answer for it." Jonah's eyes were cold as riverstone. "Then I'll answer." They left, muttering threats. Dust rose from their horses' hooves and drifted across the fields like a warning. That evening, Clara found Jonah at the fence line, staring at the horizon where the sun was sinking, red as a wound. She came to stand beside him, silent for a while. The grass whispered around them, dry and brittle underfoot. "They'll come back," she said. He nodded. "Maybe. You can't win this fight, Jonah." He turned to her, and she saw in his face not pride, but something older grief, worn and reshaped into will. "Maybe not," he said, "but I can stand for it. Sometimes that's all a man's got." Clara laid her hand on his arm. "Then we stand together." He looked at her then, really looked, and something inside him seemed to settle. He reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "You ever think," he said softly, "that maybe we were both just waitin' for a reason to keep fightin'?" She smiled, though tears blurred her eyes. "Then I reckon we found it." The next morning, she woke before the light. Jonah was already gone, his rifle missing from its place by the door. A line of mist hung low over the fields, and in the distance she heard the faint clang of metal. Clara gathered her shawl, stepped out into the pale dawn, and began to walk toward the sound. The morning air was sharp with iron and dew, heavy with the smell of damp soil. Clara walked fast, her boots sinking into the softened ground, skirts catching on the wild grass. Ahead, down by the bend of the river, she saw them 3 men, 2 with shovels, 1 with a hammer, and Jonah standing between them. He looked carved from the same earth he defended, still and rooted, his coat dark against the pale water. The men were arguing, voices raised, the clang of metal punctuating their words. "You can't stop progress," one of the surveyors said. "This track will bring life to the valley, jobs, trade. You stand in the way of all that." Jonah's voice was low, but it carried. "Maybe. But there's life here already." The man with the hammer sneered. "You think this patch of dust means anything?" Jonah stepped closer, slow and sure. "I think it means everything." The hammer swung before Clara could call out wild, clumsy, more threat than blow. Jonah caught the man's wrist mid-swing and twisted until the hammer dropped to the ground. For a moment they all froze the river, whispering behind them, the air thick with the promise of ruin. "Go home," Jonah said, releasing him. "Tell your bosses this land ain't for sale." The man stumbled back, rubbing his wrist. "You'll regret this, Reed." "Maybe," Jonah said, "but not today." They mounted their horses and rode off, their shapes swallowed by the morning haze. Jonah stood watching long after they were gone, the breath of the land rising and falling around him. Clara came up beside him, her heart hammering. "They'll come again," she said. He nodded. "They always do." She reached for his hand then, and he didn't pull away. "You can't fight the world, Jonah." His eyes stayed on the river. "Maybe not, but I can make sure it remembers me." They walked back together, their silence full but not empty. The children were waiting by the porch when they returned. Martha ran to her mother, face pale. "Ma, we heard shouting." "It's all right," Clara said gently, though her voice trembled. "It's done for now." Jonah knelt and took the youngest boy's small hand in his. "You keep close to your ma, you hear? World's mean sometimes, but it don't stand a chance against folks who hold together." That night, as the sky burned down into indigo, Jonah sat at the table, carving again. The small cedar bird lay nearly finished beside the lamp, a delicate thing, wings outstretched, ready to fly. Clara watched him from the hearth, the children asleep behind her, the fire a soft pulse of light between them. "They'll push harder," she said. Jonah nodded. "Then we push back, with more than fists." "How?" He looked up, the lamplight catching in his eyes. "You said truth changes hearts. Maybe we show them ours." 2 weeks later, the townsfolk gathered near the chapel. The railroad men had come again, papers in hand, backed by the sheriff and his deputies. But this time, they didn't find Jonah alone. He stood with Clara beside him, their children lined like fence posts, silent and solemn. Behind them were neighbors, ranchers, widows, hired hands, men and women who'd known hunger and frost and the thin mercy of the land. Jonah stepped forward, the papers fluttering in the deputy's hand. "You got a claim," he said, "but you don't got a right." The sheriff frowned. "The law says—" "The law don't know this dirt," Jonah interrupted. "Don't know the years buried here. Don't know the graves under those cottonwoods or the prayers whispered over them. You can drive your rail, but you'll drive it through our homes, our names, our dead." The preacher from town cleared his throat. "The county's decided." Clara's voice rose before she could stop it. "The county doesn't raise our children. It doesn't feed them, or bury them, or teach them how to live decent. We do." The murmur of the crowd grew. The railroad men shifted uneasily, their clean boots sinking into the mud. Jonah turned then, pointing to the river, bright under the noon Sunday. "You see that bend? That's where my wife lies, and where my new one stood when she had nothing left but a will to keep walking. This land took her in, took me in. You can't buy that. You can only earn it." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind in the grass and the creak of the chapel sign. Then an old rancher stepped forward, hat in hand. "He's right," he said. "We've given enough away." Another voice joined, then another. Soon, the crowd stood with Jonah and Clara, a wall of quiet resolve. The railroad men saw what they needed to see, the kind of strength paper can't move. They gathered their tools and left without a word. When the dust settled, Clara turned to Jonah. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in release. She touched his arm. "You did it." He shook his head. "We did." That night, after the stars had filled the sky, Jonah walked down to the river. Clara followed, barefoot, the grass cool under her feet. He stood by the cottonwoods, where a small wooden cross leaned in the earth. "She'd have liked you," he said quietly. Clara came to stand beside him, the night air soft against her skin. Then I'll thank her when I see her." Jonah smiled faintly. "You believe you'll meet her?" "I believe in the things worth waiting for," she said. He looked at her then, the moonlight silver on her face. "And what about love?" Clara took his hand, the cedar bird warm in her palm. "That one's already here." The wind stirred the trees, carrying the river's song out across the dark fields. The land, bruised but breathing, held them both. And when dawn came, it rose over a home that would not be taken.